You get nothing. Those were the first words my parents said to me at the hearing for my grandfather's $85 million estate. I sat there staring at them, trying to understand how the people who raised me could say something so cold so easily. My grandfather had always told me I would be protected after he was gone. So how could I suddenly be worth nothing? Had he really changed his mind? Had I misunderstood everything he ever told me? Or had my parents been hiding something from me? I looked across the courtroom at my father. He seemed completely confident. My mother wouldn't even meet my eyes. Then I looked at my lawyer. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't nervous. He was quietly reaching into his briefcase. And when he finally stood up, the entire room went silent. Because he had something my parents never expected him to have. The moment my lawyer stood up, I felt the entire courtroom change. But to understand why that moment meant so much to me, you need to understand what my grandfather had meant to me long before anyone mentioned an $85 million estate. Because the truth is, I never expected to inherit a fortune. I never grew up dreaming about millions of dollars. What I wanted was something much simpler. I wanted to know that my grandfather had remembered me. I wanted to believe that, after all the years of feeling like the forgotten child in my own family, there was at least one person who had truly seen me. That person was my grandfather, Richard. When I was little, my parents were always busy with my younger brother, Evan. Evan was the son they believed would carry the family name forward. Everything seemed to revolve around him. If Evan wanted something, my parents found a way to make it happen. A new car when he was old enough to drive. Help with college. Money when he started his first business. Even when he made mistakes, someone was always there to protect him from the consequences. I learned very early not to ask for much. I became the responsible daughter. The one who didn't complain. The one who figured things out on her own. And because I didn't demand attention, I think my parents slowly convinced themselves that I didn't need any. But my grandfather noticed. He noticed everything. Whenever I visited his house, he would ask about my work, my plans, and even the little things I thought nobody cared about. He remembered details my own parents forgot. One afternoon when I was in my 20s, I was sitting with him on the back porch while he drank his coffee. I had just told him that I was thinking about taking a major career opportunity, but I was afraid I wasn't good enough. He looked at me and said something I never forgot. He said, "Claire, don't measure your worth by how loudly someone celebrates you." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. I do now. Because my grandfather never treated me like I was competing with Evan. He treated me like I was already enough. That difference meant everything to me. Over the years, he became the person I called when I needed advice. Not because he was wealthy. Not because I knew how much money he had. I honestly didn't. To me, he was just Grandpa. The man who kept an old photograph of me on his desk. The man who remembered my birthday without needing a reminder. The man who would sometimes look at me for a few seconds before saying, "You're stronger than you think." And then, about a year before he died, something changed. He became more serious whenever we talked about the future. One evening we were sitting together in his study. There were old family photographs on the shelves, books stacked beside his desk, and a thick folder sitting near his hand. I didn't think much of it. Then he looked at me and said, "Claire, there may come a time when people around you tell you what you deserve." I laughed because I thought he was talking about my career. But he didn't laugh. He said, "When that happens, don't let them decide your value for you." I asked him what he meant. He just smiled. Then he said something that confused me even more. "When I'm gone, don't let anyone convince you that you weren't meant to have a seat at the table." I remember staring at him. "What table?" He didn't answer. Instead, he changed the subject. At the time, I thought it was one of those mysterious things older people sometimes say because they know something you don't. I never imagined those words would come back to me in a courtroom. 8 months later, my grandfather died. And everything changed. My parents immediately took charge of the estate. They told me they were handling the lawyers, the paperwork, the properties, and the financial accounts. I trusted them. Why wouldn't I? They were my parents. And I had never been someone who fought over money. For weeks I stayed out of the process. I was grieving. I wasn't thinking about bank accounts or property values. I was thinking about my grandfather. Then one afternoon my father called me into the living room. My mother was sitting beside him. There was a folder on the coffee table. I knew immediately that something was wrong. My father pushed the folder toward me. "Your grandfather's estate has been settled," he said. I opened it. I started reading. Then I stopped. I looked at my father. "Where am I?" He didn't answer immediately. My mother finally said, "You're not included." I thought she meant I wasn't included in one particular property. So I asked, "What do you mean?" My father leaned back. "Claire, your grandfather changed his plans." My heart sank. Changed them how? My mother looked at me with an expression I still have trouble forgetting. "He left the important assets to Evan." I stared at the papers again. I couldn't make sense of them. Then my father said the words that stayed with me all the way to that courtroom. "Your grandfather knew Evan was the one who could continue the family legacy." I felt something inside me collapse. Not because I wanted millions. Because I suddenly questioned everything. Had I imagined the closeness between my grandfather and me? Had those conversations meant something different to him than they had meant to me? Had I misunderstood his final warning? I asked to see the original estate documents. My father immediately became defensive. "Why?" "Because I want to understand what happened." "You don't need to understand everything." That answer bothered me. But I didn't push. Not then. A few days later, I was given a copy of a document that appeared to show exactly what my parents had claimed. My name was barely mentioned. The majority of the estate appeared to be going elsewhere. And then I saw the estimated value of everything my grandfather had left behind. $85 million. I remember staring at that number for a long time. But strangely, the money wasn't what hurt me most. It was the thought that my grandfather might have changed his mind about me without ever telling me. I went home that night and sat alone at my kitchen table. I kept hearing his voice. "Don't let anyone convince you that you weren't meant to have a seat at the table." For the first time, I wondered whether he had known something I didn't. So I contacted an attorney. I expected him to tell me that my parents were right and that there was nothing I could do. Instead, he read the document silently. Then he turned the page back. He looked at the date. He looked at the signature. Then he looked directly at me. "Claire," he said quietly, "who gave you this copy?" "My father." "Did you see the original?" "No." He paused. Then he asked the question that changed everything. "Are you sure this is the entire estate plan?" That question stayed with me long after I left his office. "Are you sure this is the entire estate plan?" I wasn't. And the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. For years, I had trusted my parents to handle things I didn't understand. But now I was looking at an $85 million estate, a document I had never seen before, and a grandfather whose final words suddenly sounded like a warning. So I went back to my lawyer the next morning. He had already started making calls. He didn't tell me what he suspected. Instead, he asked me to walk him through everything I remembered about my grandfather's final year. I told him about the study, the conversations, the strange way my grandfather had started talking about my future. And especially those words about having a seat at the table. My lawyer listened without interrupting. Then he asked, "Did your grandfather ever mention a trust?" I shook my head. "Not to me." He nodded slowly. "Then that's the first thing we need to find." I remember asking him why. He explained that an estate doesn't always pass through one simple will. Sometimes assets are placed into trusts, and those trusts can have separate instructions about who receives what and who is allowed to manage the assets. That was the first time I realized something important. The document my parents had shown me might not tell the whole story. My lawyer contacted the attorney who had handled some of my grandfather's estate planning. At first, we were told that certain records couldn't simply be handed over without proper authorization. But after the necessary legal requests were made, a certified copy of an older trust document was located. I still remember the moment my lawyer put it on his desk. It wasn't a thick stack of papers. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a folder. But he looked at me before opening it, and I could tell from his expression that something had changed. "Claire," he said, "I want you to stay calm." That sentence immediately made my heart race. He opened the document. Then he turned it toward me. I started reading. And there was my name. Not buried somewhere near the bottom. Not mentioned as an afterthought. My name was listed as a primary beneficiary. I read the line again. Then again. I couldn't speak. My lawyer continued explaining what the document meant. The majority of the estate had been placed under a family trust. My parents had been given authority to manage certain assets for a limited period. They weren't the owners. They were managers. And there was a specific condition attached to their authority. I looked at the date. Then I looked at my lawyer. How long were they allowed to manage it? He gave me a number. Then he looked at me. That period ended when you turned 30. I felt my stomach drop. I was 31. For a few seconds neither of us said anything. I thought about everything that had happened during the previous year. My father telling me there was nothing left. My mother insisting that my grandfather had chosen Evan. The documents they had shown me. The confidence with which they had spoken. Suddenly I had a question I couldn't ignore. If this is real, I said, why did my parents tell me I was getting nothing? My lawyer didn't answer immediately. Instead he said, that's what we're going to find out. He began requesting financial records connected to the trust. At first, everything looked ordinary. Property taxes, maintenance expenses, legal fees, investment statements. Then we started finding transactions that made less sense. Money had been moved between accounts. Expenses connected to Evan appeared in the records. There were payments that seemed unrelated to the ordinary management of my grandfather's estate. My lawyer didn't accuse anyone yet. He was careful. He told me that a transaction looking suspicious didn't automatically mean it was illegal. But there was something about the pattern that bothered him. The payments continued after the date my parents' authority was supposed to end. I stared at the records. Did they know? My lawyer leaned back. That, he said, is the question. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. I really did. They were my parents. Even after everything they had said to me, some part of me was still trying to defend them. Maybe they misunderstood the trust. Maybe the documents were complicated. Maybe my grandfather had given them some additional authority. Maybe there was something I wasn't seeing. Then my lawyer found something that made those explanations much harder to believe. A notice. It was a formal document connected to the trust. It clearly explained when my parents' authority would end and what would happen afterward. And there was something else. Their signatures. Both of them. I stared at the page. They had acknowledged receiving it. They had signed it. They knew. I felt a strange combination of anger and sadness. All those times my father had told me, there's nothing for you. He knew there was. All those times my mother had told me, your grandfather made his decision. She knew what the actual trust said. I put the document down. Why would they do this? My lawyer looked at me. I don't know yet. That answer frustrated me. I wanted a reason. I wanted to know why my own parents would look me in the eye and tell me that the man who loved me had left me nothing. But my lawyer wasn't finished. He opened another file. There is one more problem. I looked at him. What? He showed me the document my parents had given me. Then he placed the original trust beside it. The differences were subtle. A date. A clause. The way certain assets were described. But together those differences mattered. The document my parents had relied on did not match the estate plan we had just uncovered. My lawyer pointed to the page. This isn't the document that controls the trust. I felt my pulse quicken. Then what is it? He looked at me carefully. We need to determine where this came from and why your parents are presenting it as your grandfather's final wishes. That was the moment I realized I wasn't simply fighting for an inheritance. I was fighting to uncover what had actually happened after my grandfather died. And there was one question I couldn't stop asking myself. If my parents knew I was the rightful beneficiary, what exactly had they been doing with that $85 million while I believed I had been left with nothing? That question followed me everywhere. What had they been doing with the $85 million while I believed I had been left with nothing? I wanted the answer, but I was also afraid of it. Because there is a difference between discovering that someone lied to you and discovering that they planned the lie. My lawyer understood that. He told me not to confront my parents yet. Let the documents speak first, he said. So we started with the money. He requested the financial records connected to the trust and began putting every major transaction in chronological order. At first I couldn't understand what I was looking at. There were account numbers, property references, transfers, management fees, investment statements. It all looked like a foreign language. My lawyer patiently explained each item. This payment appears legitimate. This one needs further documentation. This transfer is important. And then he reached one particular transaction and stopped. He looked at me. Do you recognize this property? I looked at the address. My heart sank. It was a vacation property my brother Evan had been using. I had visited it once years earlier. My parents always called it a family property. But according to the records, Money from the trust had been used for major renovations. I asked, "Was that allowed?" My lawyer shook his head slightly. "That depends on who authorized the expense and under what authority." Then he showed me the date. The renovation had been approved after my parents' management period had ended. I stared at the page. That wasn't the only transaction. There were payments connected to Evan's business. Some were described as loans. Others were listed as family-related expenses. There were also transfers involving properties I had never even heard of. The numbers began adding up. Not millions at once. Thousands here. Tens of thousands there. Then hundreds of thousands. Individually, each transaction could have had an explanation. Together they created a pattern. My lawyer leaned back. "This is why we don't accuse them based on one payment." He tapped the records. "We look at the entire picture." And the picture was becoming harder to ignore. I asked him the question I had been avoiding. "How much of the estate is still there?" He didn't answer immediately. That silence scared me more than any number could have. Finally he said, "A substantial amount is still protected. But we need to determine exactly what was transferred when it was transferred and whether those transfers were authorized." I felt my hands go cold. My parents had spent months telling me that my grandfather had left me nothing. Meanwhile, they had been moving money from an estate that might have belonged to me. But there was still something I couldn't understand. Why would they risk everything? Why not simply tell me I was a beneficiary and negotiate some arrangement? Why create an entirely different story? Then my lawyer found the answer, or at least the beginning of one. He pulled out a notice from the trust administrator. It had been sent to my parents shortly after I turned 30. The letter clearly stated that their management authority had ended. It also explained that the assets were to be handled according to the trust's beneficiary provisions. And at the bottom were two signatures. My father's. My mother's. I looked at them for a long time. I knew those signatures. I had seen them hundreds of times. But seeing them on that document made them feel completely different. They couldn't say they didn't know. They had been told. They had signed. And they had continued anyway. I asked my lawyer if that proved they had deliberately deceived me. He was careful. "It proves they received notice. It doesn't, by itself, prove every conclusion we're considering. But it becomes very important when we compare it with what they told you afterward." That was exactly what we did. We started writing down everything my parents had told me after my grandfather died. "You're not in the estate. Your grandfather changed his mind. Evan is handling the family assets. There's nothing for you." The more we compared those statements with the documents, the more disturbing the situation became. Then we found something even more important. The document my parents had shown me wasn't simply different from the trust. It appeared to be an amendment. An amendment that, if valid, could change the distribution of certain assets. But there was a problem. The signature date was after the date my grandfather had been declared unable to manage his financial affairs. My lawyer immediately became more serious. "Now we have to establish whether this amendment was actually executed legally." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "So you're saying it might not be valid?" "I'm saying we need evidence." He contacted the attorney whose name appeared on the document. That conversation changed everything. The attorney confirmed that he had worked with my grandfather years earlier. But when my lawyer asked whether he had prepared this particular amendment, the answer was no. I remember staring at my lawyer. "Then who prepared it?" "We're trying to find out." For the first time I wasn't just hurt. I was angry. Someone had taken my grandfather's name and placed it on a document that was being used to convince me that I had no inheritance. But there was still one piece missing. My grandfather's actual final instructions. Not a summary. Not a copy from my parents. Not a document whose origin we couldn't verify. The original record. My lawyer believed it existed. And if we could find it, it could settle the central question once and for all. Did my grandfather really remove me from his estate? Or had someone tried to make it look that way? We searched through the records connected to his estate attorney, his financial advisor, and the trust administrator. Days passed. Then one afternoon my lawyer called me. His voice sounded different. He told me to come to his office immediately. When I arrived, there was a new file sitting on his desk. I sat down. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he looked at me and said, "Claire, before I show you this, I want you to remember something." I nodded. "Whatever is in here, don't let it change what you know about yourself." I didn't understand. Then he opened the file. Inside was a document my grandfather had signed shortly before his death. It wasn't the amendment my parents had shown me. It wasn't the trust we'd already discovered. It was something else. A final confirmation of his wishes. I began reading. And within seconds tears filled my eyes. Because my grandfather had anticipated exactly what I was going through. He had written instructions specifically designed to prevent anyone from taking control of my inheritance simply because I was his granddaughter. But there was one sentence that made me stop breathing for a moment. My lawyer pointed to it. Then he said quietly, "This is the document your parents never wanted the court to see." For a few seconds I couldn't bring myself to turn the page. My grandfather's words were sitting right in front of me, but I was afraid of what they might say. After everything I had been told, I had learned to question even the memories I once trusted. Finally I looked at my lawyer. "What does it say?" He slid the document closer to me. It was a final confirmation of the trust arrangements. My grandfather had reaffirmed that I was to remain the primary beneficiary of the estate. There was no confusion. No suggestion that he had changed his mind. No instruction that Evan should receive everything. In fact, the document made something else very clear. My parents were never supposed to become the owners of the estate. They were temporary managers. Their responsibility was to protect the assets until the trust's conditions were fulfilled. And those conditions had already been fulfilled. By me. I read the page again. Then I whispered, "He knew." My lawyer nodded. He anticipated that there could be a dispute. That hurt more than I expected. My grandfather had known that someone might try to interfere with what he had planned for me. And instead of simply trusting everyone around him, he had put protections in place. I thought back to that afternoon in his study. Don't let anyone convince you that you weren't meant to have a seat at the table. Suddenly I understood. He hadn't been speaking about some business meeting. He had been preparing me for this. I couldn't stop the tears. For months I had wondered whether I had imagined the relationship we shared. Now I had proof that I hadn't. My grandfather had remembered me. He had planned for me. And he had deliberately protected my future. But my lawyer wasn't finished. "There is another part you need to see." He turned the page. There was a separate written instruction attached to the estate documents. It wasn't a long letter. It was personal. My grandfather had written that he didn't want the inheritance to become a reason for the family to fight. He wanted the person receiving it to understand that wealth was not a measure of worth. Then he addressed me directly. He wrote that if I ever found myself being told that I wasn't deserving of what he had left behind, I should remember that he hadn't chosen me because I was better than anyone else. He had chosen me because he trusted me. I had to put the paper down. I covered my face with my hands. For years I had secretly wondered why my parents never seemed proud of me. Why Evan could make one mistake after another and still receive another chance, while I felt like I had to prove myself every time I walked into a room. My grandfather had seen something in me that I hadn't always been able to see in myself. And now I knew why his final words had mattered so much. My lawyer gave me a moment. Then he said, "Claire, this document changes our position completely." I looked up. "How?" "Because now we aren't simply arguing about what your grandfather intended. We have written evidence confirming it." I nodded slowly. But then fear returned. What if my parents say he wasn't capable of signing it? My lawyer had already considered that. "We'll establish when it was signed, who witnessed it, and what records support his capacity at that time." He had a plan. But I still had one problem. My parents. They had already told the court their version of events. They had already presented the other document. And they weren't going to quietly admit they had been wrong. My lawyer warned me that their attorneys could try to portray me as someone who had suddenly become interested in money after my grandfather's death. That possibility terrified me. Because I knew exactly how my parents would describe me. Greedy. Entitled. Ungrateful. I had spent my entire life trying not to be those things. I didn't want the court to see me that way. I asked my lawyer, "What if they convince everyone I'm doing this for the money?" He looked directly at me. "Then we don't make the case about what you want." He tapped the documents. "We make it about what your grandfather actually signed." That sentence gave me strength. For the first time I stopped thinking about defending myself emotionally. I had documents. I had records. I had the original trust. And now we had my grandfather's final confirmation. But there was still another problem. My lawyer needed to connect the documents to the money that had already moved. If my parents had continued managing the estate after their authority ended, we needed to know exactly what happened. So he kept digging. The financial records showed that certain transfers had happened after the date my parents received notice that their authority was over. Some money had gone toward Evan's business. Some had been used for property expenses. Other transactions were still being investigated. Then we found something that made the entire situation even more serious. One of the estate properties had been used as collateral for a financial arrangement involving Evan. My parents had approved the transaction. And they had done it after their management authority had ended. I stared at the paperwork. Could they do that? My lawyer shook his head. Not without proper authority. I felt a chill. This wasn't just about hiding an inheritance anymore. They had potentially made decisions involving assets they no longer had the right to control. And there was one final piece of evidence we needed. Something that could show whether my parents knew exactly what they were doing. A communication between them and the estate administrator. My lawyer requested it. When the records finally arrived, he read them before showing them to me. His expression told me enough. What is it? He handed me the page. It was an exchange about the trust. My father had been warned again that the beneficiary provisions were already active. My mother had responded afterward. I read the message. Then I read it again. They weren't confused. They weren't asking for clarification. They were discussing how to keep control of the assets while avoiding my involvement. I felt my chest tighten. I had spent weeks looking for an explanation that would make their actions easier to understand. There wasn't one. They knew. They had known. And they had still looked me in the eye and told me I would get nothing. I asked my lawyer, "What happens now?" He closed the file. Now we go back to the hearing. The hearing was only days away. My parents had no idea how much evidence we had uncovered. They believed the document they presented would settle everything. They believed I was walking into that courtroom with nothing but an accusation. They didn't know about the original trust. They didn't know about the final confirmation. They didn't know about the financial records. And they certainly didn't know what my lawyer was carrying in his briefcase. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I kept thinking about my grandfather. Not the money. Not the courtroom. Just him. I remembered sitting beside him on that porch. I remembered the way he looked at me when he said I was stronger than I thought. And I realized something. For years, I had been waiting for my parents to tell me I was enough. My grandfather had already told me. I just hadn't understood it. The next morning, I walked into the courthouse beside my lawyer. My parents were already there. My father looked completely confident. My mother wouldn't look at me. Their attorney had a thick folder in front of him. They still believed they had the advantage. Then the judge entered. Everyone stood. The hearing began. Their attorney presented the document claiming my grandfather had removed me from the estate. My father watched me carefully. For a moment I felt that old doubt returning. What if this still wasn't enough? What if the judge believed them? What if all those documents somehow weren't enough to undo everything they had done? Then I looked at my lawyer. He was calm. Almost strangely calm. The judge reviewed the document and prepared to move forward. My father leaned back in his chair. My mother finally looked at me. And I could see the confidence in her eyes. She believed the matter was almost finished. Then the judge asked whether the opposing side had anything further to present. My lawyer slowly closed the folder in front of him. He stood. And I suddenly remembered the question he had asked me weeks earlier. "Are you sure this is the entire estate plan?" Now the entire courtroom was about to learn the answer. For a moment nobody moved. My lawyer stood beside me, holding the folder that contained everything my parents had hoped would never reach that courtroom. The judge looked at him. "Counsel." My lawyer took a breath. "Your Honor, before the court relies on the document presented by the other side, I believe there are several documents that need to be entered into evidence." My father's expression changed. Just slightly. But I noticed it. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. My mother looked at me. And for the first time since the hearing began, she looked nervous. My lawyer placed the first document on the table. The document presented by the petitioners is not the controlling estate document. The room became completely silent. My father's attorney immediately objected. He argued that the document they had presented represented my grandfather's final wishes. My lawyer didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Then the court should have no objection to reviewing the original trust." The judge asked for it. My lawyer handed it forward. I watched the judge read the first page. Then the second. Then the third. Her expression became more serious. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but preparation didn't stop me from being afraid. What if there was something in those pages we had missed? What if my parents had another document? What if my grandfather really had changed his mind? The judge looked up. "Miss Clare, you're listed as the primary beneficiary?" My lawyer answered before I could. "Yes, Your Honor." My father's attorney immediately tried to explain that the trust had been modified. My lawyer nodded. "That is precisely the issue." He placed the document my parents had presented beside the original trust. "They are relying on this amendment." The judge examined it. My lawyer continued. "But this amendment has not been established as a valid modification of the controlling trust." My father's face had gone pale. I could see his hands tightening around the edge of the table. My lawyer then introduced the estate records showing when my grandfather's management authority had been established and when my parents' authority had ended. He pointed to the date. "Claire turned 30 last year." The judge nodded. "The trustee's authority ended at that point under the terms of the trust." My lawyer looked toward my parents. "Yet financial activity continued after that date." My mother's attorney objected again. He said those transactions had legitimate explanations and that there was no evidence my parents had acted improperly. My lawyer didn't argue with him. Instead, he opened another folder. "This is the financial record." Page after page. Transaction after transaction. He explained each disputed transfer carefully. Some involved estate properties. Some involved payments connected to Evan. Some involved financial arrangements that had been made after my parents' authority had expired. The courtroom was quiet. There was no dramatic shouting. No angry confrontation. Just documents. And somehow that was more powerful. Because every time my parents' attorney tried to explain one transaction, another document appeared. I looked at my father. The man who had sat across from me at home and told me with complete confidence that I would receive nothing now looked like someone who had finally realized the conversation wasn't going the way he expected. Then my lawyer reached for another document. "This is the notice sent to both trustees." He showed the court the document explaining when their authority ended. Then he showed the signatures. My father's signature. My mother's signature. The judge looked at them. "You both received this notice?" My father hesitated. His attorney answered carefully. "Yes, Your Honor." My lawyer nodded. Then there should be no question that they were aware of the trust's requirements. My mother finally spoke. "We were trying to protect the family." Her voice was shaky. My lawyer turned toward her. "From whom?" She didn't answer. My father tried instead. "From irresponsible decisions." I felt something inside me tighten. I had spent my entire life hearing versions of that explanation. They were protecting Evan. Protecting the family. Protecting the legacy. But somehow, every version of protection always meant that I had to be the one left out. My lawyer didn't respond emotionally. He simply turned to the judge. "Your Honor, there is one final document." I knew what it was. My grandfather's final confirmation. The document I had read in my lawyer's office. The one that had made me cry. The one my parents had never mentioned. My lawyer placed it before the judge. This was signed shortly before Mr. Richards' death. It reaffirms the beneficiary provisions and confirms that the trust was not revoked. The judge read it. Then she looked toward my parents. Why was this document not disclosed? My father's attorney started speaking. He said they had concerns about its timing. He questioned whether my grandfather fully understood what he was signing. My lawyer was ready. He introduced the supporting records. The date. The witnesses. The professional records surrounding the signing. The evidence connected. One piece to another. And suddenly, the argument my parents had built around one questionable document began falling apart. But then came the moment I had been dreading. My father looked directly at me. "Claire." I didn't answer. He continued. "You know your grandfather wanted the family together." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was painful. He was trying to turn the conversation back into a family disagreement. as if this were simply my brother and me arguing over something Grandpa had left behind. But this wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about Evan. It wasn't even about the money anymore. It was about the fact that my parents had told me a story that wasn't true. I finally looked at him. "You knew," I said quietly. He stared at me. "You knew what Grandpa left me." He didn't answer. My mother began crying. She said they were afraid that giving me control of the estate would destroy the family. I listened. And for the first time I didn't feel the need to defend myself. My grandfather had already done that. His documents had already spoken. The judge reviewed the evidence one final time. Then she announced that the estate would be administered according to the valid trust documents and that the disputed transactions would be subject to further review. My father lowered his head. My mother covered her face. Evan sat completely silent. And I just sat there. I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. I felt exhausted. For months I had believed that my grandfather had chosen someone else. For months I had wondered whether I had somehow failed him. Now I knew the truth. He hadn't forgotten me. He had protected me. And the people who told me I deserved nothing had known it all along. My lawyer sat down beside me. He quietly closed his briefcase. I looked at him. "Is it over?" He gave me a small smile. "The hearing is over." I looked toward my parents. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. And strangely that didn't hurt anymore. Because I finally understood something my grandfather had tried to teach me years earlier. A seat at the table isn't something another person gets to give you. And it isn't something they can take away simply because they don't want you there. For years, I had spent my energy trying to convince my parents that I was worthy of their respect. That day sitting inside that courtroom I stopped. The $85 million estate had exposed the truth. But the real inheritance wasn't the money. It was the certainty that I no longer needed their permission to know my own worth. For years I thought the hardest part would be discovering what my grandfather had left me. I was wrong. The hardest part was discovering that the people I trusted most had known the truth and still told me I deserved nothing. But sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's finally learning to trust yourself. And now I want to hear from you. If you were in Claire's place, would you have forgiven your parents, or would you have walked away? Tell me in the comments. And if this story touched something in you, subscribe to the channel. Stay with us for more stories where truth has a way of finding its way into the light.